All right, guys, time for another head coaching candidate profile, and this is somebody that we have already requested an interview with, so there's some degree of interest. Maybe it's just a tiny bit, but there's something here with Raheem Morris. This guy's been around. He's still not that old, 47 years old. The thing with Raheem Morris that is going to throw some people off a little bit is that he did have a chance as a head coach previously, and he failed. Failed very badly, actually, in Tampa Bay. Now, that was a long time ago. He's had the opportunity to learn a lot since then. And I do find it notable that this guy has worked on both the offensive and defensive sides of the ball as an assistant and positional coach. So there's a little bit of roundedness to him that you usually don't see. And sometimes I kind of feel like a guy fails out on one side and then comes back to the other side, or ends up being chosen as an offensive or defensive guy because they were really bad at one side. That's not really the case here with Raheem Morris. So let's run down his resume. And the recent stuff is pretty good. He was the defensive coordinator for the Rams, replacing Brandon Staley after he went to the Chargers. And he's been solid, not great. This most recent year, the Rams defense was okay. Not a lot of talent. He was working with a lot of young players. He got great stuff out of guys like Kobe Turner and Byron Young. It was a defense that had lost most of their blue chippers except for Aaron Donald, and he got them to an okay level. Not great, not the best, but workable. The previous year, they had a billion injuries. Defense was below average, approaching bad, but he didn't let them completely bottom out. The 2022 Rams were bad mostly because their offense just died, more so than the defense completely dying. So 2022 Rams defense was understandably below average. And then, of course, the year the Rams won the Super Bowl in 2021, the defense was average by points per game, about 22. And in EPA, they were top 10, negative 0.025. So, pretty good track record in LA. Now, he has had Aaron Donald for most of that time. He has had other really good players, like a little bit of Von Miller, a little bit of Leonard Floyd, a little bit of Taylor Rapp, a little bit of Jalen Ramsey. But he's also had some degree of success when he's lost those players. Rams made the playoffs this year, partially because their defense was passable with not a lot of superstar players. Okay, so that's the main stuff to look at. But I do want to step back into his tenure as an Atlanta coach because he actually did a lot for this Falcons team. He wore a lot of hats over about a 6 year period, and it's worth going over. Now, it ended poorly because in 2020, he started the year as the defensive coordinator, and then Dan Quinn got fired, so he got pushed into the head coach role. So he took over for Quinn at the end of 2020 and went 4-7. Now, I'm not going to hold that against him because that's actually a lot better than what Dan Quinn did. Dan Quinn started 0-5, and he was able to jump in there and immediately take over and do a respectable job. Not a good job, but a respectable job. However, it is worth noting that while he was a defensive coordinator during those first 5 games, the Falcons had almost the worst defense in the league. They were giving up 32 points a game, 31st in the league, and their EPA was an abysmal .173 EPA, 30th, when he was the DC. Again, I want to stress that. Once he became the head coach, the defense actually became much better for whatever that's worth. It still wasn't great or anything like that. Remember, this was the COVID year too. It was really hard to play defense in the COVID year. Now, in the 4 years prior to 2020, he had 3 separate roles. So it's going to take a while for me to get through all this. He was the assistant head coach, passing game coordinator, and wide receiver coach. This is why I said what I said about him being a defensive and offensive guy kind of at the same time, which is weird. So from 2016 to 2019, 3 different roles: assistant head coach, passing game coordinator, wide receiver coach. To go backwards on it, to 2019, the team was not very good. It was a 7-win team, but they were top 3 in passing yards, and they were slightly above average in dropback EPA, .089, respectable, very decent. 2018, they were 7-9 again, but they were top 4 in passing yards. Matt Ryan always putting up a prolific passing attack in Atlanta. .199 dropback EPA, sixth in the league. So they had an elite passing attack in 2018. 2017, 10-win team, almost 4,000 passing yards, eighth in the league. .185 dropback EPA was third. So again, it's an elite passing attack. And 2016, 11-5. This was the Super Bowl year, third in the league in passing yards, and first in the league by far in dropback EPA, .323. Absolutely off the chart stuff from the passing attack in Atlanta. And the receivers that he worked with during this time, Julio Jones, future Hall of Famer, Calvin Ridley, didn't totally work out in Atlanta, but definitely a guy who produced, Russell Gage, Mohamed Sanu, and Taylor Gabriel. So you'd probably have to conclude he did his job over this run, right? Like the passing attack was great, the receivers were good, and the team had some success. That ran out a little bit at the end there, but during this stretch, he was definitely doing a good job. And then in 2015, he was just the assistant head coach and pass game coordinator. 2015 Falcons, first year with Dan Quinn and Shanahan, 8-8, sixth in passing yards, 10th in dropback EPA per play, respectable .113. So again, doing a pretty good job, doing well. And I think this Falcons tenure needs to be considered when you're looking at Raheem Morris. It's not the best, but he's showcased some real interesting abilities. Now, before his Atlanta tenure, he spent 3 years with the Washington Redskins as a defensive back coach, and it was bad. The Washington defense was terrible during these 3 years. 29th in points, 30th in points, 22nd in points, 30th in EPA, 23rd in EPA, 22nd in EPA. So all 3 years, abysmal defense, not a good mark on his resume. Some of the defensive backs that he worked with during that time, Ryan Clark, who now works on ESPN, Bashad Breeland, I remember him, Brandon Merriweather, former first-round pick, Josh Wilson, former Seahawk, D'Angelo Hall, I remember him very well, Reed Dowdy, David Amerson, and MartyWilliams. So he did touch bases with some fairly notable defensive backs during this time, but the results were bad, in fairness, and maybe that's part of the reason why he went to Atlanta and focused on offense for several years. Interesting to think about, at least. Now we get to his tenure as the Tampa Bay Buccaneers head coach, and this is something that people are going to be put off by, understandably so. He was a head coach already. He had 3 years in Tampa Bay, failed, fell on his face, and cleared out of there for Greg Schiano. So the year that got him fired was 2011. They went 4-12 and had the worst defense in the league, 32nd, 31 points a game almost. 2010 was his one good year. That was the Josh Freeman year where the Buccaneers had a 10-win record, 10-6. They beat the Seahawks head to head, but the Seahawks made the playoffs at 7-9 because they won their division, and 10-6 was not enough to get the wild card that year. So 19.9 points per game was ninth in the league, so they had a good defense, respectable, and yeah, it was a good season, and it seemed like things were headed in the right way. And obviously they didn't go. Now his first season was really bad, 3-13, 25 points per game allowed, which was bad, 27th. So that was not a very impressive run of head coaching work. But again, I think it's important to keep in mind that people can learn things. People can learn from a bad experience. That's what Pete Carroll did. Pete Carroll failed in New England as a head coach, went to USC, came back from USC, went to Seattle, and had a lot of success. So maybe Raheem Morris has learned something from his first failure. Before he was the head coach in Tampa, he was the defensive backs coach for 2 years, 2007, 2008. And there were a lot of very prolific defensive backs in Tampa Bay during this time. And the defense was very prolific as well. 2008, they were 10th in the league in points allowed, 20.2. Year before, they were elite, less than 17 points a game, third in the league, 2007. Rondé Barber, Tenard Jackson, Jermaine Phillips, Philip Buchanan, Sabi Piscatelli, Aqib Talib, his rookie year, was part of that squad, and Brian Kelly. I can't remember if Rondé Barber's made the Hall of Fame yet, but he probably should. Aqib Talib obviously had an amazing career. Brian Kelly was a good cornerback for his day. Jermaine Phillips and Philip Buchanan were nice players. So this is a pretty interesting section of the resume here. I'm relatively impressed. So good work in Tampa Bay before he became a head coach. The year before that, in 2006, he was the Kansas State Wildcats defensive coordinator, and their defense was basically average, 23.8 points per game allowed, 66th. Nothing to write home about. I looked at Kansas State's roster, no big time notable defensive players that he was attached to. And before then, he was in Tampa. Spent a lot of time in Tampa on and off. Assistant defensive back coach for 2 years, '04 and '05. Basically working with a lot of the same guys that he was working with before. Rondé Barber, Brian Kelly, Tenard Jackson, I think, was still there. Basically the same crew, just as an assistant DB coach. And the defense was really good. 2005, they were 8th in the league in points allowed, and 2004, they were 9th in points allowed. So he was part of some good defensive stuff. So that's the resume. It does go back further, but we're getting into stuff that really doesn't matter at all because it happened before the turn of the millennium. So I'm not going to get into that. I just want to focus in on the last approximately 20 years where you can see that he had a lot of influence on the really good Buccaneers defense of the mid to late OOs. You can see that he did flunk out as a coach and he did have very little success in Washington. But then you can see him turn his career around in Atlanta on the offensive side of the ball and then do a pretty good job these last 3 years in LA. So this is not exactly something I would be pumped about, but I think this resume is actually probably a little bit more impressive than even a guy like a Mike Vrabel. Like, I look at this resume from Raheem Morris, and I look at the fact that he's actually younger, and I think I would rather do this than a guy like a Vrabel. I would put this on a similar level to Dan Quinn. Again, I wouldn't be like pumped about it, but I think there is some stuff here that people need to give him a little more credit for. So I like it. I don't love it. I feel like we can do better, but seems like he deserves a second chance at the head coaching position at this point. See you guys later. Go Hawks.